I buried my father at low tide, in the 1 hour of the day when the harbor clock above us wasn't ticking, because it hadn't ticked in 3 years. Everyone in town said I'd let it die along with him. They didn't know the truth, that I stopped it myself the night I chose my own future over his last breath, and that I'd spent every year since paying a debt no one could see. Then a stranger arrived with a toolbox full of borrowed time, and he looked at the broken thing I'd built my whole life around and said, "It's not dead. It's just been waiting for the right hands." I didn't know yet that he meant mine, or his, or both of ours together. I didn't know a man who fixed clocks for a living was terrified of staying anywhere long enough to be loved. But what happened next changed my life forever. Solitude Bay keeps its grief in brass and glass. That's what my father used to say about the tide clock, the great copper-faced instrument bolted into the harbor tower since 1911, its twin hands built not to tell the hour, but to tell the sea's intentions, when it would rise, when it would retreat, when it would leave the fishing boats stranded on the mudflats like something forgotten. He tended it for 30 years the way other men tend gardens, with patience that looked, from the outside, like love. I inherited the patience. I never asked for the love. My name is Idris Calloway, and for 3 years I have climbed the 142 steps of the harbor tower every morning at 6, not to win the clock because it no longer runs, but to dust the glass so the town can pretend it might. I am 29 years old. I repair outboard motors for a living, and I count things when I'm anxious: steps, waves, the seconds between a boat leaving the pier and disappearing around the point. I have counted so many things in this town that I sometimes forget I'm allowed to want something for myself. The tower was going to be sold. The town council had voted, reluctantly, to auction the land to a development firm that wanted to turn the harbor into condominiums with a view. And the clock, my father's clock, useless and rusted and beautiful, was going to be melted down or shipped off to some private collector's foyer, whichever paid more. I told myself I didn't care. I had told myself that for 3 years about a great many things. Then, on a gray Tuesday in April, a green pickup truck with a trailer of tools rattled over the causeway and parked at the base of the tower, and a man climbed out of it like he had nowhere else in the world to be, which I would later learn was exactly the problem. He was tall in the unhurried way of someone who had never needed to prove it, dressed in a canvas jacket gone soft with age, dark curls pushed back under a knit cap despite the mild weather. He looked up at the tower the way you'd look at an old friend you weren't sure still recognized you. "You're not supposed to be here," I said, because that's the kind of thing I say instead of hello. "Neither are you, technically," he said. "This is town property. But here we both are." He held out a hand, weathered and ink-stained. "Wren Ashcombe, the Historical Society hired me. Apparently, there's a clock in there worth saving before they sell the view out from under it." I did not shake his hand right away. I looked past him at the trailer, at the careful rows of tools I recognized from my father's old catalogs. Mainspring pliers, a jeweler's loop, brass polish older than me. "It can't be saved," I said. "Better people than you have tried." Wren smiled like I'd told him a secret instead of a warning. "Then it's a good thing," he said. "I've never once believed the people who told me something was already dead." I didn't know, standing there in the cold harbor wind, that he was talking about more than the clock. I wouldn't understand that for weeks. But something in his voice made the back of my neck go warm, and I hated how much I wanted him to be right. Wren Ashcombe had 6 weeks, a signed contract, and a rule he told me about on his second day, like it was a fact of nature. He never stayed anywhere longer than a job required. Old clocks, old churches, old lighthouses, he said, running gloved fingers along the tide clock's seized gear train. I go where something's forgotten how to keep time. I remind it, and then I leave before I get too used to the view. "That sounds lonely," I said. "It sounds efficient," he said, though he didn't quite look at me when he said it. We were an unlikely pair to be shut in a tower together. Me, who measure my days in the exact number of steps between my truck and my front door. Him, who whistled while he worked and left tools scattered like he trusted the world not to steal from him. He asked too many questions. He laughed at his own jokes before I could decide whether they were funny. On our third day, he found my father's old logbook wedged behind the clock's brass housing, its pages soft with damp, and instead of handing it to me right away, he read 3 entries aloud. in a voice gentle enough that I had to look out the window so he wouldn't see my face. "Your father talked to this clock like it was a person," he said. "He talked to it more than he talked to me," I said, and regretted it instantly because it was true and because I never said it out loud to anyone. Ren didn't offer comfort. He didn't reach for me the way people do when they want credit for kindness. He simply set the logbook down between us, carefully like something alive. "My father talked to clocks too," he said. "Then one day he told me he was going out to fix 2 towns over, and he never came back to fix anything of mine again." He said it lightly, the way you learn to say the worst thing about yourself once you've said it enough times to strangers. So I understand a little. Talking to brass, because the people are harder. I didn't ask him more. He didn't ask me more. But that evening, when he packed up his tools and told me he'd be back at 7, I found myself standing on the tower steps longer than I needed to, watching his taillights disappear around the harbor road, counting for the first time in 3 years. Not out of anxiety, but because I wanted to know exactly how long until 7 came again. By the second week, we had a rhythm, the kind you don't notice building until it's already load-bearing. I brought coffee. He brought sandwiches from the bakery on Tide Street. Always insisting he bought extra by accident. We worked through the clock's ruined gear, train inch by inch, and I discovered that Ren Ashcombe, who filled silences with jokes and half-finished sentences, went completely quiet and reverent the moment his hands touched something 100 years old. It was the only time he seemed to slow down. "You don't fix things," I told him one afternoon, watching him coax a corroded escapement free without forcing it. "You negotiate with them. Everything worth keeping needs to be asked nicely," he said. "Machines, people, towns that don't want you." He glanced at me sideways. "You, for instance. You've been negotiating with me since the day I got here. I let you keep your tools in the tower. You brought me coffee for 9 days straight and pretend it's about the clock. I didn't have an answer for that, so I handed him the thermos and let him win." It was in that 3rd week that we found the letters, a small bundle wrapped in oilcloth, tucked into a hollow beneath the clock's original foundation stone, addressed to no one, signed only with an initial. They were written by the tower's first builder, in 1911, to a man he called only my dearest companion in the work, describing long nights calibrating gears by lamplight, describing a love neither of them could speak of anywhere but inside these letters and this machine. The final page read, "As long as this clock keeps time, know that I kept my promise to you." Ren read it twice, quietly, and then looked at me with something unguarded in his face for the first time. "They built 100 years of secrecy into brass," he said, "so it would outlast the silence." "Do you think they were happy?" I asked. "I think," he said, "they found a way to be loved that the world couldn't take back from them. That's its own kind of happy." I looked at the letters, then at him, and understood, without wanting to yet, that I had started measuring my days by whether he would be in the tower when I arrived. That the counting I'd done my whole anxious life had quietly, dangerously become about him. April folded into May, and solitude Bay turned the particular gold it only wears for a few weeks each spring. Low sun on wet slate roofs, gulls arguing over the pier, the smell of low tide drifting up through the tower's open windows like a held breath finally released. Ren started staying past 6 weeks' worth of hours without saying so. He taught me to see the clock's flaws as history instead of failure. The dent in the copper face from a storm in 1962, the mismatched screw someone had used in a hurried repair during the war, the faded numeral 7 a previous keeper had touched up in the wrong shade of gold. "None of it's broken," he said, tracing the dent with one finger. "It's just been through things. Same as you." "You don't know what I've been through," I said, not unkindly. "No," he agreed, "but I know you climb 142 steps every morning to dust a clock that doesn't run, for a father who isn't here to see it. That's not nothing, Idris." It was the first time he'd said my name like it mattered, like it was a word he wanted to keep in his mouth a little longer than necessary. I felt it land somewhere under my ribs. We started eating dinner on the tower's iron balcony some evenings, watching the boats come in, saying less than we probably should have, and meaning more than either of us admitted. He teased me about my counting, the steps, the tides, the exact 11 seconds it took me to unlock the tower door every morning, and instead of feeling exposed, I fell for the first time in years known. One evening, With the sky bruising into violet over the water, he reached over and tucked a loose thread on my sleeve back into place, an absent, unthinking gesture, and then went very still when he realized his hand hadn't moved away. "Ren," I said. "I know," he said quietly. "I know what this is starting to look like." Neither of us moved for a long moment. The tide clock, silent as it had been for 3 years, sat between us like a held question neither of us was brave enough yet to answer. He told me about his father on a night the rain came in sideways off the strait, hard enough that we'd propped tarps over the exposed gear housing and retreated to the small keeper's room at the base of the tower, damp and cold and closer together than either of us planned. I was 9, Rin said, watching the rain instead of me. He told me he was going to fix the church clock in Aldermere, said he'd be back by Sunday to take me fishing. He fixed the clock. He never came back for the fishing or for me. My mother found out 6 months later he'd started a new family 2 counties over. Different kid, different Sunday. "Ren, I don't tell people that," he said. "I tell them the efficient version. Never stay long enough to matter. So leaving doesn't feel like what he did to me. Just professional distance." He laughed, short and humorless. "Except I've been in this town 11 weeks for a 6-week contract, Idris, and I haven't made a single excuse to leave." I sat with that a long moment, rain drumming overhead. "Why haven't you?" I asked, though some coward's part of me already knew the answer and was terrified of it. He finally looked at me, and there was nothing performing in his face anymore. No jokes, no deflection, just a plain and frightened honesty. "Because for once," he said, "I found something worth being afraid of losing. And I don't know what to do with that, because everyone I've ever loved this much has taught me that staying is how you get left behind." I reached over, slowly, and took his ink-stained hand in mine, the way you'd hold something you were afraid might be too fragile for certainty. "I'm not your father," I said. "I know," he said. "I'm trying to believe it fits, that you're not him, and I'm not the boy on the dock. I'm trying, Idris. I just need you to be patient with how badly I want to run." "I've spent my whole life being patient with things that don't move," I said. "I can be patient with a person who's trying to." He exhaled like he'd been holding his breath for 11 weeks, and outside, the rain kept falling on a clock that still refused to tell anyone what time it was. I told him mine 3 nights later, because fairness demanded it, and because I was tired of being the only one in a room made of locked doors. "My father had a heart condition," I said. Everyone knew. I knew. The week before he died, I'd been accepted into a marine engineering program in Halifax. Full scholarship, 3 years away. I hadn't told him yet. I was going to the night he asked me to help him with the clock's winter maintenance, and I told him I was busy. I went out instead, with friends, because I was 26 and selfish and terrified of watching his face when I told him I was leaving Solitude Bay. Ren didn't speak. He just watched me, steady, the way you watch someone crossing something dangerous alone. He climbed the tower himself that night, I said, 142 steps in the cold, to fix something I should have helped him with. His heart gave out at the top. They found him at dawn, next to the clock, and it stopped the same hour he did. Like it decided grief was easier than ticking. "Idris, I never went to Halifax," I said. "I gave up the scholarship. I took over his motor repair shop, and I've climbed those 142 steps every morning since, because it's the only apology I know how to give a man who can't hear it. I let this clock die because I killed the man who loved it, and I've been paying for that every day since by refusing to let myself want anything as much as he wanted this tower." Rin reached for me then, both hands steady on either side of my face, in a way no one had touched me since the funeral. "You didn't kill him," he said. A heart that was already failing gave out on 142 stone steps. That is not a debt. That is not a sin you get to carry for the rest of your life like a stone in your pocket. Then why does it feel like one? "Because grief doesn't check its math," he said. "It just wants somewhere to live. And you gave it a clock tower instead of a person who could tell you the truth." His thumb moved, gentle along my jaw. "You are allowed to want things, Idris. You are allowed to be loved without paying for it first." I don't remember which of us moved first. I only remember the rain outside had stopped, and the tower was quiet, and for the first time in 3 years the silence didn't feel like punishment. We didn't rush it. I think we were both too aware of how much damage rushing had already done to the people who came before us. But something had shifted unmistakably in the weeks after that night. In the way Ren's hand found the small of my back when we climbed the tower stairs together. In the way I started reaching for 2 mugs instead of 1 before he'd even arrived. In the way neither of us pretended anymore that his 6-week contract had ever meant 6 weeks. The storm came at the end of May, the worst the harbor had seen in a decade, and it tore the tarps loose from the exposed clock face and threatened to flood the mechanism we'd spent 2 months coaxing back toward life. We climbed 142 steps together at 2 in the morning, soaked through before we reached the 10th, and worked by lantern light to save the gear train while wine screamed through the tower's old windows. If this floods, Ren shouted over the storm, we lose 2 months of work. Then we don't let it flood, I shouted back, and something about doing this together, bracing the same beam, cursing the same stuck bolt, laughing helplessly when a gust nearly took the tarp and both of us with it, felt more like partnership than anything I'd built alone in 3 years of grief. When the worst of it passed, we sat soaked and shaking with adrenaline on the tower floor, lantern light flickering gold across the brass gears we'd saved. You could have stayed home, Ren said quietly. This isn't your job anymore. You gave that up. I didn't come up here for the clock, I said. He looked at me for a long moment, rain still dripping from his curls, and then he closed the distance between us and kissed me. Careful at first, like he was still asking permission from some old wound, and then not careful at all like 11 weeks of almost had finally run out of patience. When we broke apart, he pressed his forehead to mine, breathing hard. I don't know how to stay, he admitted. I've never learned. But I don't want to be the kind of man who leaves you the way I was left. Then don't learn how to stay, I said. Learn how to come back. That's all I need to know how to trust. Outside, the storm cleared, and above us, for the first time in 3 years, the clock's smaller hand shuddered. Just slightly, like something remembering how to move. The town council meeting was scheduled for the 2nd week of June. The vote to finalize the land sale already assumed a formality by everyone but the Historical Society and, apparently, us. Ren's contract, extended twice already under increasingly thin professional pretenses, was due to end regardless of the vote. He'd been offered another job, a lighthouse in Nova Scotia, good money, a name that would help his reputation. He hadn't told me until I found the letter on the truck's dashboard, half written, half torn, the way you write something you're not sure you'll have the courage to send. You were going to leave without telling me, I said, and it came out harder than I meant it to. I was going to tell you, he said. I just don't know how to say it without it sounding like the thing my father said to me. I'll be back. I've never once believed those words when I've said them. Idris. I don't want to lie to you the way he lied to me. So instead you'll just go. Instead I'm terrified, he said, raw now, no jokes left to hide behind. Because if I stay, and it falls apart, I become the reason you learn not to trust anyone again. And if I go, I become exactly the man I swore I'd never be. There isn't a version of this where I don't feel like I'm about to ruin something. I understood, suddenly and painfully, that we were standing in the same fear from opposite directions. Me, terrified of wanting something enough to lose it the way I'd lost my father. Him, terrified that staying was a promise he didn't trust himself to keep. I'm not asking you to promise me forever, I said. I spent 3 years punishing myself for a promise I never got to keep to my father. I won't do that to you, and I won't let you do it to yourself. But I need you to at least be honest about being scared, instead of just disappearing into a lighthouse 2 provinces away. Ren was quiet a long time, the harbor wind moving between us. The council vote is in 5 days, he finally said. Let me see this through. The clock. Us. Whatever we've built here. And then let's decide together. Not because either of us is running, but because we actually choose it. It wasn't a promise. But for the first time, it felt like the truth, and I had learned, painfully, that truth was worth more than promises anyway. 2 nights before the vote, unable to sleep, I went back through my father's logbook and the builder's letters one more time, searching for something, I didn't know what, that might save the tower the council had already, in every practical sense, sold. I found it in the final letter, the one Ren had read aloud that first week, in a line I'd skimmed past too quickly to understand. I have written the names of every keeper who tends this clock into the foundation stone itself, that the ones who come after might know they were never as alone in this work as they believed. I went to the tower before dawn and pried up the loose foundation stone wren and I had uncovered weeks earlier, and beneath it, carved in careful copperplate, were names, dozens of them, spanning a century, keepers and craftsmen who had tended this clock in secret partnerships the town had never known to look for. My father's name was there. Beside it, in fresher script, was another name I didn't recognize, a name history had quietly erased the way it had erased so many like it. The tide clock wasn't just a machine. It was a monument built by two men in love, maintained across a century by a lineage of quiet, unspoken devotion, hiding in plain sight inside brass gears the whole town, called civic infrastructure. I understood, standing there in the gray pre-dawn light, that I had spent 3 years treating my inheritance as a debt when it had always been an invitation, to be as brave as the men who built it, to let love be visible instead of buried under guilt and silence. I called Wren before the sun was fully up. He arrived breathless, hair uncombed, and I showed him the stone, the names, the truth the tower had been keeping longer than either of our griefs. This isn't just heritage the council can auction off, I said. It's 100 years of people like us, choosing each other in a town that never made room for the choosing. If they know that, if the whole town knows that, they can't sell it for a view. Wren looked at the names, then at me, something fierce and hopeful breaking open in his face. Then let's tell them, he said. All of it. The clock, the letters, us. For the first time in 3 years, I wasn't afraid of being seen. The council chamber was packed the night of the vote. Fishermen, shopkeepers, the historical society, and a scattering of curious neighbors who'd heard rumors that something unusual was about to happen. I stood at the podium with my father's logbook in one hand and the century-old letters in the other, and I told them everything. About the builder and his companion. About the names beneath the foundation stone. About my father, who had died at the top of 142 steps, trying to keep a promise I'd been too afraid to let him keep in peace. My voice shook. I let it shake. This tower isn't a view, I said. It's the only place in this town where men like me have ever been allowed to love out loud, even if they had to hide it in brass to do it. I stopped that clock myself, the night my father died, because I thought grief and guilt were the only inheritance I deserved. I was wrong. What he actually left me was permission, to want something, to keep something, to be loved without earning it first. I looked at Wren, standing near the back of the room, hands in his pockets, watching me with a quiet, terrified pride. I love a man who fixes things for a living and has spent his whole life afraid to stay anywhere long enough to be loved back, I said, and the room went very still. I'm done being afraid of what this town will think of that. I'd rather be seen and imperfect than hidden and safe. The vote, when it finally came, was not unanimous. Some things in small towns never are, but it was enough. The tower was saved, reclassified as protected heritage before the ink on the sail could dry, and the tide clock, still and silent for 3 years, would keep its 100-year vigil after all. Afterward, in the emptying hall, Wren crossed the room and took both my hands like he was afraid I might disappear if he didn't. You changed everything tonight, he said. So did you, I said. 11 weeks ago, I didn't know I was allowed to want anything. You made me believe I was worth loving before I ever said it out loud. And now? He asked. Now I'm choosing to believe it without you having to convince me every day, I said. That's the difference. That's what you actually gave me. The tide clock runs again. It took the rest of that summer. New springs cast to match the original 1911 specifications, the dented copper face polished but never fully erased of its history. The mismatched wartime screw left exactly where it was, because some scars are worth keeping visible. On the morning it finally ticked back to life, the whole harbor gathered at the base of the tower to hear it, and when the smaller hand shuddered forward for the first time in 3 years, I found I wasn't thinking about my father's death at all. I was thinking about how he would have loved to see it running again, and for the first time, that thought didn't come wrapped in guilt. Wren stayed. Not because I asked him to, and not because he was afraid to leave, but because, as he put it one evening on the tower balcony, Watching the boats come home gold-lit under a September sky. Some towns are worth staying in long enough to build something instead of just fixing what's already broken. He opened a small restoration workshop on Tide Street, the first business the harbor had seen in a decade that wasn't a bakery or a bait shop, and taught half the town's children how gears remember time, even when they've forgotten how to move. I applied to the marine engineering program again that autumn. A different one, closer, so I wouldn't have to choose between the town I'd finally learned to love and the future I'd once been too afraid to claim. I still climbed the 142 steps some mornings, not out of guilt anymore, but because the view from the top, with Wren's workshop light glowing faintly on the street below, has become the only kind of counting I still need. We found the builder's companion's name, eventually, in an old parish register nobody had thought to check in a century. A quiet confirmation of a love the town had never known to grieve or celebrate. We had a small plaque made, mounted beside the foundation stone, listing every name that history had once erased, including, now, 2 more, mine and his. Some nights, when the tide clock ticks steady and sure above the harbor, I think about the letter that started all of this. As long as this clock keeps time, know that I kept my promise to you, and I understand, finally, that promises were never the point. Showing up was choosing again and again to stay long enough to be known. He made me believe I was worth loving. And in believing it, I changed everything. Not just the clock, not just the town, but the quiet, guilty architecture of my own heart, brick by brick, brass gear by brass gear, until there's finally room enough inside it for both of us to live.